She bought her mother-in-law a brand new SUV, and gave me a $5 gift bag, I said quietly, turning the cheap paper handle between my fingers as if it might explain itself if I looked long enough. But it didn't. It just crinkled softly in my hand while the applause for Patricia still echoed across the restaurant patio. Glasses clinking, people smiling, someone even wiping away a tear as if they had just witnessed something beautiful, something meaningful, and I sat there in my navy dress, the one I'd pressed carefully that morning, wondering how it was possible to feel invisible in a room full of people who knew my name, or at least used to, because a few tables over I heard someone whisper, "Is that her real mom?" And the answer came back in a shrug I didn't see but somehow felt, and I kept my smile steady, the kind you learn after years of choosing peace over pride. As Emily stood beside Patricia with her arm wrapped around her shoulders, laughing softly, calling her Mom, in that warm tone I used to hear on the other end of late-night phone calls when my daughter needed advice, needed comfort, needed someone to tell her everything would be okay, and now that word belonged to someone else, handed over as easily as the car keys glinting in Patricia's hand, brand new, probably $50,000 if I had to guess, not that I needed to guess because I knew Emily's finances better than she thought. I always had, I just never imagined I'd be sitting here, holding a gift bag that smelled faintly of discount candles and printed ink, while the woman who had known my daughter for barely 10 years was treated like she had raised her from birth, and I lowered my eyes to the tissue paper, carefully folded, too neat to have been done with love, and when I opened it, there it was, a small candle with a clearance sticker still attached and a pre-printed card that said, "Happy Mother's Day," with no handwriting inside, no message, no signature, just emptiness where something personal should have been, and I traced the edge of the card with my thumb, remembering the construction paper cards Emily used to make when she was 7, crooked letters, glitter that never quite stayed in place, and the way she would look up at me, waiting, hoping, asking without words if it was enough, and I always told her it was more than enough, because it was made with love, and that was all that mattered. But this wasn't about money, not really. It wasn't even about the candle or the bag or the fact that I had spent 30 years making sure she never had to choose between groceries and gas the way I did when she was little, working double shifts, standing on my feet for 12 hours at a time just to keep the lights on in a small apartment that never quite felt like home until she filled it with her laughter. And I didn't think about those years often, not because they weren't important, but because they were simply what a mother does. You give, you sacrifice, you show up, over and over again, without expecting applause, without expecting anything at all, but sitting there, watching Emily adjust Patricia's coat, fussing over her as if she might catch a chill in the mild spring air, I felt something shift inside me, not a sharp pain, not anger, just a quiet realization settling in like dust after a long day, the kind you don't notice until the light hits it just right, and suddenly everything becomes clear. And it wasn't just this moment, it wasn't just the car or the gift bag, it was the last few years unfolding in reverse, one small detail at a time, like puzzle pieces finally finding where they belong. The missed invitations, the holidays that were rescheduled without telling me, the birthdays where I arrived early only to find out I had the wrong day, or so I was told, the phone calls that grew shorter, more polite, more distant, and I told myself it was normal, that children grow up, that they build their own lives, their own families, and you step back, you give them space, because that's what love looks like when it's done right. But then I heard a small voice behind me, light and careless, and I turned just in time to see my granddaughter run past, her curls bouncing as she reached Patricia and wrapped her arms around her waist. "Grandma, look what I drew," she said, holding up a piece of paper covered in bright crayon lines, and Patricia bent down, smiling wide, praising every color as if it were a masterpiece, and I waited, just for a second, expecting her to turn, to remember I was there too, but she didn't, and the word echoed in my mind, "Grandma, not me, not anymore," and I sat back in my chair, the noise of the restaurant fading into the background, replaced by a quiet hum of understanding that was somehow louder than anything else, because in that moment, it wasn't just about being overlooked, it was about being replaced, not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, carefully, over time, until there was nothing left of the role I once held except memories I carried alone. And I looked down at the candle again, turning it over to see the price tag still stuck to the bottom, $5, and I almost smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was honest in a way everything else wasn't. It told me exactly where I stood, no confusion, no guessing, just a simple number attached to a simple object, and I placed it back into the bag, folding The tissue paper the same way it had been when I received it, neat, untouched, like a performance no one questioned. And when Emily finally turned to me, her smile bright, her voice cheerful as if nothing at all was out of place, I met her eyes and said, "Thank you, sweetheart," because there are moments when you don't need to argue, you don't need to ask why, you just need to see, really see, what's been right in front of you all along. And as I sat there, hands folded calmly in my lap, I realized this wasn't the beginning of something painful, it was the end of something I had been holding onto for far too long, and for the first time in years, I wasn't confused, I wasn't hurt, I was simply aware, and that awareness, quiet and steady, was the first step towards something they would never see coming. The ride home was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that feels peaceful, it was the kind that hums under your skin, the kind that makes every small sound feel louder than it should be, the turn signal clicking, the tires rolling over uneven pavement, the faint rustle of the gift bag sitting on the passenger seat beside me, and I kept my eyes on the road as the late afternoon sun stretched across the windshield, thinking about how strange it was that nothing had actually changed in the last hour and yet everything felt completely different, because the restaurant was still there, Emily was still my daughter, Patricia was still just a woman who married into the family, but something invisible had shifted into place, like a final piece locking into a puzzle I had not realized I was solving, and when I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a moment longer than usual, hands resting on the steering wheel, listening to the engine tick softly as it cooled, and I glanced over at the bag again, the thin paper slightly crumpled now, and I reached for it slowly, not with anger, not with urgency, just with a kind of careful curiosity, as if I were handling evidence rather than a gift, and when I stepped inside the house, the familiar scent of lemon cleaner and old wood greeted me, steady and unchanged, and I placed the bag on the kitchen counter before removing my shoes and hanging my coat in the same place I always did, because routines have a way of grounding you when everything else feels uncertain, and I moved through the house with quiet, deliberate steps, turning on the small lamp by the window, filling the kettle with water, setting it on the stove, each action simple, controlled, as if I were reminding myself that I still knew how to move through my own life. And when the kettle began to hum softly, I opened the bag again, pulling out the candle and setting it on the counter beside the sink, and this time I did not just glance at it, I studied it, the brand name, the clearance sticker, the faint scent of artificial lavender, and I turned it over in my hands, noticing the way the label was slightly off-center, the kind of detail you would only notice if you were really looking, and I wondered, not for the first time, how long it had been since Emily had really looked at me, not glanced, not acknowledged, but truly seen me, and the thought did not hurt the way it might have once, it simply settled into place beside everything else I had begun to notice, and I poured myself a cup of tea, carrying it to the small table by the window where I used to sit when Emily was in high school, waiting for her to come home from late shifts at the diner, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one, and I sat down now in the same chair, the wood worn smooth beneath my hands, and I took a slow sip, letting the warmth settle in my chest as I looked out at the quiet street, and that was when the memories began to line up, not in a rush, not all at once, but one by one, steady, clear, undeniable. The time Emily told me the Thanksgiving dinner had been moved to the following weekend, only for me to see photos online of a full table set the day I had stayed home, the birthday party for my grandson where I arrived with a carefully wrapped gift only to find the room already half empty, the cake cut, the candles long gone, and Emily laughing it off, saying I must have written the time down wrong, the Christmas morning when she insisted they were keeping things small and quiet. Just immediate family, and later I learned that meant everyone except me. And I remembered how I had explained each moment away at the time, how I had told myself that mistakes happen, that schedules get mixed up, that people forget, especially when they are busy, and Emily was busy, she always had been, juggling work, children, a life that seemed to expand further away from mine with each passing year, and I had been proud of that, proud of her independence, her success, her ability to build something of her own, and I had never wanted to be the kind of mother who demanded attention or made things difficult. So I adjusted, I stepped back, I made myself smaller in ways that felt reasonable at the time, because love, real love, is supposed to be flexible, it is supposed to make room, but sitting there now, the tea cooling in my hands, I realized that flexibility had slowly turned into absence, not by accident, but by design, and the thought was not dramatic, it was not even emotional. It was simply logical, because the pattern was too consistent, too precise to be anything else. And I set the cup down gently, reaching for my phone, not with hesitation. but with purpose, and I opened my banking app, scrolling through transactions that I had not paid much attention to before, small amounts at first, nothing that would raise concern, $100 here, $200 there, labeled in ways that seemed ordinary enough at a glance, household expenses, shared costs, things I had agreed to help with when Emily said they were getting on their feet, and I had trusted her, of course I had, because she was my daughter, and trust is not something you calculate, it is something you give, freely, without keeping score. But now I looked closer, not just at the amounts, but at the timing, the frequency, the gradual increase that mirrored something I had just seen with my own eyes, and I began to add the numbers together, not with urgency, not with panic, just with quiet focus, and when I reached the end, I sat back in my chair, the total resting in my mind with a clarity that did not need to be spoken aloud, and it was not shocking, not in the way people expect these things to be. It was simply confirming, like hearing the final note of a song you already know by heart, and I placed the phone face down on the table, my hands resting calmly on either side of it, and for a moment, I closed my eyes, not to escape, but to steady myself in the truth I had just uncovered, and when I opened them again, the room looked exactly the same. The light still soft, the street still quiet, the candle still sitting on the counter where I had left it. And I realized that whatever came next would not begin with confrontation or questions or raised voices. It would begin with understanding, with preparation, with the kind of patience that does not rush toward answers but waits for them to reveal themselves fully. And I stood up slowly, carrying my cup to the sink, rinsing it carefully before setting it on the drying rack, and as I turned off the light and headed toward the hallway, I glanced once more at the small gift bag on the counter, and this time, I did not see it as an insult or an afterthought. I saw it for what it truly was, a message, clear and unmistakable, one that I had finally learned how to read, and as I walked upstairs, the house quiet around me, I knew that whatever Emily thought she had given me that afternoon, it was not the candle that mattered, it was the truth, and I intended to use it. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Not because I had somewhere to be, but because my mind had already settled into a rhythm that would not allow me to drift any longer between what I used to believe and what I now understood, and I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the house, the kind of quiet that feels different once you have stopped expecting it to be filled by someone else. And I thought about Emily, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with a kind of careful distance, as if I were looking at a photograph that had been in my home for years and only now noticing the details I had missed before, the slight tilt of her smile, the way her eyes never quite met the camera, and I realized that clarity does not arrive all at once, it builds slowly, layer by layer, until one day you can no longer pretend you do not see what is right in front of you. And I sat up, pulling the blanket aside, placing my feet on the floor with the same deliberate calm I had carried into the night, and I moved through my morning routine without rushing, making coffee, opening the curtains, letting the pale sunlight stretch across the kitchen counter where the candle still sat exactly where I had left it, untouched, unchanged, and I paused for a moment, looking at it, not as something trivial, but as a marker, a point in time that separated what I had been from what I was becoming, and I reached for my phone again, not to check messages, not to scroll through photos, but to continue what I had started the night before, because once you begin to look closely, it becomes difficult to stop. And I opened my email, searching for statements, confirmations, anything that would help me understand the full picture, and it did not take long before patterns began to emerge more clearly, transfers linked to dates that matched conversations I remembered too well, times when Emily had called me with a soft, careful tone, explaining that things were tight, that they just needed a little help to get through the month, that it was temporary, always temporary, and I had believed her, of course I had, because trust does not question. It responds, it gives, it supports, and I had never asked for details, never requested receipts, never followed up to see where the money had actually gone, because that would have felt like doubt, and doubt has no place in the kind of relationship I thought we had, but now I could see it, not as isolated moments, but as a structure, something built over time with intention, and I leaned back slightly, my fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table as I let the information settle, not rushing to conclusions. Not assigning blame, just allowing the truth to take its full shape, and as I sat there, I remembered a conversation from nearly a year ago, one that had seemed ordinary at the time, Emily mentioning that they were thinking about making a big purchase, something that would improve their quality of life, something they had been planning for a while, and I had smiled, told her she deserved it, that she had worked hard, that she should enjoy the life she was building, and she had thanked me, her voice warm, appreciative, and I had felt proud. Proud of the woman she had become, proud that I had played a part in helping her get there, and now, sitting at the same table, with the same light filtering through the same window, I understood that conversation differently, not as a daughter sharing her plans, but as a step in a process I had not realized I was part of, and I closed my eyes briefly, not out of frustration, but out of recognition, because the signs had been there, not hidden, just presented in a way that made them easy to overlook if you were not looking for them, and I opened my eyes again, steady, focused, and I picked up my phone, scrolling to a contact I had not called in years, someone who had known my husband when he was alive, someone who had helped us organize our finances when things were simpler, when everything felt shared and secure, and I hesitated for just a moment, not because I was unsure, but because I understood that once I made this call, I would be stepping fully into something new, something that required more than awareness, it required action, and I pressed the call button, holding the phone to my ear as it rang, each tone steady, measured, until a familiar voice answered, slightly older, but still clear, still grounded, and I introduced myself, explaining briefly why I was calling, not giving too much away, just enough to begin the conversation, and as I spoke, I noticed something shift within me, a quiet confidence replacing the uncertainty that had once guided my choices, because I was no longer reacting, I was preparing, and when the call ended, I placed the phone back on the table, my hand resting beside it for a moment longer than necessary, and I looked around the kitchen again, the same space that had witnessed years of ordinary mornings, simple routines, conversations that once felt complete, and I realized that this space, like everything else, was still mine, unchanged by the choices of others, grounded in the life I had built with my own hands, and I stood up slowly, walking to the counter where the candle remained, and this time, I picked it up with a different understanding, not as something insignificant, but as the beginning of something precise, something deliberate, and I turned it over once more, the $5 sticker catching the light, and I allowed myself a small, quiet smile, not because the situation was amusing, but because it was clear, and clarity, I had learned, is far more powerful than comfort, and as I set the candle back down and reached for my keys, I knew that whatever Emily believed about the story she had been telling, whatever version of events she had shared with others, it would not hold up for much longer, because I was no longer the person who accepted things at face value, I was the person who looked beneath them, and what I was beginning to uncover was only the first layer. The office was exactly how I remembered it, quiet in a way that felt intentional, as if every sound had been considered before being allowed to exist, the soft hum of the air conditioning, the faint rustle of paper somewhere beyond the glass walls, and when I stepped inside, I felt something settle in my chest. Not relief, not yet, but a kind of steadiness that comes from being in a place where things are measured, documented, understood, and Daniel Harris looked up from his desk as I entered, his expression shifting from polite recognition to something warmer, something that carried a memory of a time when my husband was still alive and we would sit together in this same room discussing plans that felt permanent, plans that assumed continuity, and he stood, extending his hand, greeting me with a familiarity that did not require explanation, and I took my seat across from him, placing my purse carefully on my lap, my posture straight, my voice calm as I began to explain why I was there, not in dramatic terms, not with accusations, but with clarity, outlining what I had seen, what I had noticed, what I had begun to question, and as I spoke, he listened without interruption, his fingers lightly touching the edge of a notepad, his expression attentive but neutral, the kind of neutrality that professionals learn over years of hearing stories that are never as simple as they first appear, and when I finished, he nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something he had already suspected, and he asked me a few questions, precise, focused, not about how I felt, but about what I knew, dates, amounts, names, accounts, and I answered each one as carefully as I could, not guessing, not filling in gaps, only offering what I was certain of, and when there were details I did not have, I said so, because this was not about building a narrative, it was about uncovering one, and he turned slightly in his chair, pulling up records I had not seen before, documents that had been part of arrangements my husband had insisted on years ago, things I had signed without fully understanding at the time, trusting him in the same way I had trusted Emily, believing that the people closest to me would always act in ways that protected me, and Daniel explained each item with quiet patience, pointing out structures, accounts, provisions that had been designed not just for convenience, but for security, and I listened, my hands resting still in my lap, as the picture expanded beyond what I had pieced together on my own, because what I had seen so far was only the surface, and beneath it there were layers, safeguards that had been placed there deliberately, perhaps even with a future like this in mind, and I felt a brief, unexpected gratitude toward my husband, not for what he had left me, but for what he had anticipated, for the way he had understood that life does not always unfold as we expect, that trust, while necessary, is not always enough. And Daniel paused for a moment, looking directly at me now, his voice slightly lower as he said, "Margaret, you have more control here than you realize." And the words did not surprise me, not exactly, but they settled into place with a weight that made them undeniable, and he continued, explaining how the accounts were structured, how access was granted, how permissions could be changed, how decisions could be made without requiring approval from anyone else, and I listened without interrupting, absorbing each detail, not with urgency, but with precision, because this was not a situation that called for haste, it called for understanding, for timing, for the kind of patience that allows actions to land exactly where they need to. And when he finished, he leaned back slightly, giving me space, not pushing, not suggesting, simply allowing me to decide how I wanted to proceed, and I sat there for a moment, the information settling into something solid, something usable, and I realized that this was the moment where many people might feel anger, might feel the need to confront, to demand explanations, to force acknowledgement, but I did not feel any of that. What I felt was clarity. And clarity does not shout, it does not rush, it simply moves forward, one step at a time, and I looked at Daniel, meeting his eyes steadily as I said, "I am not interested in creating a scene," and he nodded slightly, as if he had expected that answer, and I continued, "I just want to make sure that what belongs to me remains mine." And the simplicity of that statement seemed to shift something in the room, because it removed emotion from the equation, leaving only facts, and facts are much easier to work with. And Daniel reached for a folder, sliding it across the desk toward me, explaining the steps we could take, the adjustments that could be made quietly, without drawing attention, changes that would not disrupt anything on the surface, but would alter the structure beneath in ways that could not be undone without my consent. And I opened the folder, scanning the documents, the language formal but clear enough that I could follow it without difficulty, and I nodded once, not because I understood every detail, but because I understood enough to know that this was the right direction. And as I signed the first page, my hands steady, my movements deliberate, I felt something shift again, not externally, nothing visible, but internally, a transition from awareness to action, from observation to participation. And when the last document was signed, I closed the folder gently, sliding it back toward him, and he gave me a small, respectful nod, not congratulating, not reassuring, simply acknowledging that something important had just been set in motion. And I stood, gathering my things, thanking him for his time in a voice that carried the same calm I had brought with me. And as I walked out of the office, the sunlight outside seemed slightly brighter, not because the world had changed, but because I had. And when I reached my car, I paused for a moment before getting in, looking back at the building, at the glass doors that reflected my own image back at me, and I noticed something I had not seen before, not in my appearance, but in my posture, the way I held myself, the way I stood without hesitation, without uncertainty. And I opened the door, sliding into the driver's seat, placing my keys in the ignition, and as the engine started, I allowed myself a single, quiet thought, not about Emily, not about what she had done or why, but about what would happen next, because whatever story she believed she was in control of, whatever version of events she had built so carefully over the past few years, it was about to meet something she had not accounted for, something she had never needed to consider before. And I adjusted the mirror slightly, my reflection steady, composed, and I drove away. Not toward confrontation, not toward explanation, but toward the next step, knowing that for the first time in a long time, I was no longer reacting to what had been done to me, I was deciding what would be done next. The changes began quietly, exactly the way I intended them to, without announcements, without confrontation, without giving anyone a reason to look too closely at what was shifting beneath the surface. And over the next few days, I moved through my routine as I always had, making my morning coffee, watering the small plants by the window, checking the mail at the end of the driveway, each action steady, familiar, unremarkable, because the most effective changes are the ones that do not draw attention to themselves. And while nothing in my outward behavior suggested anything different, behind that calm routine, things were being adjusted one detail at a time, permissions reviewed, access quietly restricted, notifications rerouted so that I would see everything before anyone else did. And I followed Daniel's guidance carefully, not rushing, not skipping steps, because this was not about catching someone off guard. It was about restoring balance in a way that could not be easily undone. And by the end of the week, I could feel it, not as a dramatic shift, but as a subtle realignment, like a house settling back onto its foundation after years of leaning just slightly to one side. And I did not need confirmation to know it was working, but it came anyway, earlier than I expected, in the form of a phone call that arrived just after noon on a Thursday, Emily's name lighting up my screen, and I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before answering, not to make a point, but to give myself a moment to step fully into the version of myself I had decided to become. And when I picked up, my voice was calm, even, "Hello, sweetheart," and there was a pause on the other end, brief but noticeable, as if she had expected something else, something sharper, something reactive, and when she spoke, her tone was light, but there was a thread of tension running beneath it. "Hey, Mom, I was just checking in," and I could hear it in the way she chose her words, careful, measured, not quite as effortless as before, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, my gaze resting on the window in front of me as I listened, allowing the silence to stretch just enough that she would feel the need to fill it, and she did, continuing with a small laugh that did not quite land. "It has just been a busy week, you know how things get," and I nodded, even though she could not see me. "Of course," I said, keeping my tone neutral, giving her nothing to push against, and there was another pause, longer this time, and then she asked, casually, almost too casually, "Did something change with the account?" And the question settled in the air between us, simple on the surface, but carrying everything beneath it, and I did not answer immediately, not because I needed time, but because I understood the weight of that moment, the way a single response could shape everything that followed. And when I spoke, my voice remained steady. "I have been reviewing things," I said, choosing each word with care, not offering explanations, not creating openings for argument, just stating a fact, and she exhaled softly, a sound that carried more meaning than any words she might have used, and I could almost picture her on the other end, standing in her kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, trying to understand what she could not yet see, and she shifted quickly, her tone brightening again. "Oh, well, I just noticed something was a little different. I thought maybe there was a mistake," and I allowed a small pause before responding, not to create tension, but to maintain control of the rhythm. "There is no mistake," I said gently, and that was all, because sometimes the most powerful statements are the ones that leave no room for interpretation. And the silence that followed was different now, heavier, more aware. And she cleared her throat lightly. "Okay, well, if you are looking at things, maybe we should sit down together and go over everything, just to make sure we are on the same page." And I almost smiled at that, not because it was amusing, but because it was predictable, the sudden interest in clarity, in collaboration, in alignment, and I kept my tone warm, but firm. "I think I understand everything I need to understand," I said, and I let the words settle without adding anything more, and for a moment, she did not respond, and in that silence, I could feel the shift, not dramatic, not explosive, but undeniable, a recognition that something fundamental had changed, something she had not anticipated. And when she spoke again, her voice was softer, more cautious. "Mom, is everything okay?" And it was an interesting question, not because of what it asked, but because of what it revealed, the assumption that my actions must be tied to emotion, to discomfort, to something that needed to be fixed. And I considered my answer carefully, not because I did not know what to say, but because I wanted it to be true in a way that required no further explanation. "Yes," I said simply, "everything is exactly as it should be," and I meant that, not as a reassurance for her, but as a statement of fact for myself. And there was a long pause. After that, the kind that stretches just enough to make both people aware of it, and then she said, "Okay," her voice quieter now, less certain, and we exchanged a few more words, polite, surface level, the kind of conversation that fills space without adding anything to it. And when we hung up, I placed the phone back on the table, my hand resting beside it for a moment as I looked out the window again. The same street, the same light, the same stillness, and yet everything felt aligned in a way it had not before, not because I had changed her, not because I had explained anything or forced acknowledgement, but because I had adjusted my position within the structure that had been quietly shifting around me for years, and for the first time, I was no longer reacting to what I was given, I was defining what was allowed. And as I sat there, the house quiet around me, I realized that this was only the beginning, not of conflict, not of confrontation, but of something far more controlled, far more deliberate, a process that would unfold at its own pace, revealing more with each step. And I was ready for that, not because I wanted to prove anything, but because I finally understood what had been happening all along, and understanding, once it settles in, does not go away, it simply waits for you to act on it. The following days unfolded with a quiet precision that almost felt invisible to anyone who was not paying attention, and that was exactly the point, because nothing in my routine changed on the surface. I still woke at the same hour, still brewed my coffee the same way, still checked the mail at the end of the driveway, still answered calls with the same calm tone, but underneath that steady rhythm, there was a growing awareness of how each small adjustment I had made was beginning to ripple outward, not dramatically, not in a way that would cause alarm, but in subtle, undeniable ways that could not be ignored forever, and I noticed it first in the timing of Emily's messages, the way they began to arrive earlier in the day, more frequent, more intentional, as if she were trying to re-establish a connection that had quietly shifted beyond her reach, and I read each one carefully, not rushing to respond, not ignoring them either, simply allowing space between her words and my replies, because space has a way of revealing what urgency often hides, and when I did respond, I kept my tone consistent, warm but measured, offering nothing that could be misinterpreted as an opening to return things to how they were before, and I could sense the difference even through the screen. The way her words carried a slight hesitation now, a carefulness that had not been there before, and it was not fear, not exactly, but awareness, the realization that something had changed in a way she could not yet define, and that uncertainty was doing something that no argument ever could. It was forcing her to look more closely at what she had once taken for granted, and I did not interfere with that process, because clarity, when it comes from within, is far more powerful than anything imposed from the outside. And later that week, I received another call, this time in the evening, just as I was finishing dinner, and when I answered, Emily's voice was softer than usual, not weak, but careful. "Mom, I was thinking maybe we could have lunch this weekend," she said, and I could hear the intention behind the invitation, not casual, not spontaneous, but deliberate, and I set my fork down slowly, considering not whether I would go, but how I would, because this was not about avoiding her, it was about meeting her from a position she had not yet experienced, one where I was not responding to her expectations, but to my own understanding, and I agreed, choosing a place I knew well, a small restaurant not far from my house, quiet enough for conversation, neutral enough to hold whatever needed to be said. And when the day came, I arrived a few minutes early, taking a seat by the window, my hands resting lightly on the table as I watched people pass by outside, their lives moving in steady, ordinary patterns. And when Emily walked in, I noticed it immediately, not in what she wore or how she carried herself, but in the way her eyes searched the room, scanning, looking for something more than just my presence. And when she saw me, she smiled, but there was a question behind it, one she had not yet formed into words, and she sat down across from me, her movements slightly more deliberate than usual, as if she were aware that this meeting was not like the others, and we exchanged the usual pleasantries, ordering our food, commenting on the weather, the kind of conversation that fills space while both people decide how to move forward, and I allowed that space to exist without rushing to fill it, because silence, when held correctly, can be more revealing than any question. And eventually, she leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped together on the table. "Mom, I just feel like something is off," she said, her voice steady but searching, and I met her gaze without hesitation, not challenging, not avoiding, simply present, and I considered my response carefully, not because I needed to soften it, but because I wanted it to be exact. "Things are different," I said, and I let the statement stand on its own, without explanation, without elaboration, and she nodded slowly, as if confirming something she had already sensed. "Is it about the other day?" she asked, and I could see the moment she was referring to without needing her to say it, the restaurant, the car, the gift bag, the applause, all of it compressed into a single question that carried more weight than the words themselves, and I did not deny it, but I did not center it either. "It is about more than one day," I replied, my tone calm, my words measured, and she looked down briefly, her fingers tightening slightly around each other before she spoke again. "I did not think it was a big deal," she said, and there was something in that sentence that clarified everything, not because it was surprising, but because it was honest, and honesty, even when it reveals something difficult, is always useful. And I nodded once, acknowledging her perspective without agreeing to it. "That is part of the problem," I said gently, and I watched as she processed that, not defensively, not immediately, but slowly, as if the meaning was unfolding in real time. And for a moment, neither of us spoke, the sounds of the restaurant continuing around us, plates being set down, conversations overlapping, life moving forward without pause. And I realized that this was not a confrontation, it was a recalibration, a moment where two versions of the same relationship were being held side by side, one that had existed for years and one that was only now beginning to take shape, and I did not need to explain everything, I did not need to list every detail or justify every decision, because what mattered was not the past itself, but how it was understood moving forward, and as we sat there, the conversation unfolding in quiet, deliberate steps, I could see the shift happening, not in dramatic gestures or sudden realizations, but in small, subtle adjustments, the way she listened more carefully, the way she chose her words with greater intention, the way she began to recognize that the version of me she had grown accustomed to was no longer the one sitting across from her, and when the meal ended, we stood, exchanging a brief, polite goodbye, nothing unresolved, nothing concluded, just a recognition that something had changed in a way that would continue to unfold beyond that moment, and as I walked back to my car, the late afternoon light stretching across the pavement, I felt the same steady clarity that had been guiding me since that day at the restaurant, not stronger, not louder, just consistent, and consistency, I had come to understand, was what allowed real change to take hold, not in bursts, not in reactions, but in quiet, deliberate actions that reshape everything over time. In the days after our lunch, nothing dramatic happened, and that was exactly what made everything feel different, because instead of a single moment that could be explained away or forgotten, there was a steady, quiet shift that continued to unfold in ways that were impossible to ignore once you started paying attention, and I noticed it first in how Emily began to reach out, not with the same easy confidence she used to have, but with a kind of careful intention, as if each message, each call, had to be considered before it was sent, and I responded in the same calm, measured way I had learned to maintain, not cold, not distant, but no longer filling in the spaces for her, no longer anticipating what she needed before she asked, and it was in those spaces, the ones I used to fill without thinking, that something new began to take shape, because for the first time, she had to sit with the silence, with the absence of immediate reassurance, with the realization that the rhythm she had relied on was no longer automatic, and one afternoon, a few days later, I received a message from her that was shorter than usual, more direct, asking if she and the children could come by that weekend, and I read it twice, not because it was complicated, but because I understood what it represented, not just a visit, but an attempt to step back into a space that had always been available to her, and I set my phone down for a moment. Before responding, not delaying out of hesitation, but out of intention, because I wanted my answer to reflect not just what I felt, but what I had come to understand, and when I replied, I kept it simple, telling her that she was welcome to come by in the afternoon, nothing more, nothing less. And when the day arrived, I prepared the house the same way I always had, light cleaning, fresh towels in the bathroom, a pot of coffee ready on the counter, because hospitality was not something I needed to change, it was part of who I was, and I was not interested in becoming someone else just to match the behavior I had experienced, but what had changed was the expectation behind it, because I was no longer preparing out of a need to be appreciated, I was simply preparing because I chose to, and when I heard the car pull into the driveway, I stood by the window for a moment, watching as Emily stepped out, followed by the children, their movements quick, familiar, and then Patricia stepping out from the passenger side, adjusting her coat as she looked around, and that detail did not surprise me, not anymore, it simply confirmed what I had already begun to understand, and when they reached the door, I opened it before they knocked, greeting them with the same calm warmth I had always offered, stepping aside to let them in, and the children moved past me quickly, their energy filling the room in a way that felt both familiar and slightly distant at the same time, and Emily followed, her smile polite, her eyes searching, and Patricia came in last, her presence composed, her expression pleasant but reserved, and for a moment, we all stood there, the air holding a quiet tension that no one addressed directly, and I gestured toward the living room, inviting them to sit, and as they settled in, I moved to the kitchen, pouring coffee into cups, setting them on the table, each movement deliberate, unhurried, because I understood that this was not about what was said immediately, it was about how everything was being observed, and as I returned to the room, I noticed the way Emily's eyes followed me, the way she seemed to be looking for something that was not there, perhaps a reaction, perhaps a sign that things were the same as they had always been, and when I sat down across from them, I allowed the conversation to begin naturally, the children talking about school, about small things that carried their own kind of importance, and I listened, responding when appropriate, offering attention without overextending it, and after a while, as the initial energy settled, Emily leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on her knees, and she spoke in a tone that was careful but direct. "Mom, I just want to make sure everything is okay between us." And I met her gaze steadily, not avoiding, not softening, simply present, and I considered my response with the same precision I had been using in every decision since that day at the restaurant, and when I spoke, my voice was calm, even. "Everything is clear," I said, and I let that be enough for a moment, because clarity does not always require explanation, and she nodded slowly, as if trying to interpret what that meant, and Patricia, who had been quiet until then, shifted slightly in her seat, her expression thoughtful, and she added, in a tone that was meant to be supportive, "Families go through phases. It is important to stay connected," and I turned my attention to her briefly, acknowledging her words with a small nod, not dismissing them, but not engaging with them beyond what was necessary, because this was not her conversation to guide, and Emily spoke again, her voice softer now. "I do not want things to feel distant," she said, and there was something genuine in that statement, something that might have reached me differently if it had come at another time. But now, I heard it with a different understanding, not as a request for closeness, but as a recognition of distance that had already been created, and I responded in the same steady tone. "Distance does not happen all at once," I said, and I watched as the meaning of that settled in, not fully, not yet, but enough to create a pause, and in that pause, I could see it, the moment where awareness begins to take shape, where assumptions start to shift, where the story someone has been telling themselves no longer fits as easily as it once did, and the rest of the visit continued without conflict, without raised voices, just a quiet underlying awareness that something fundamental had changed, and when they eventually stood to leave, gathering their things, the children already moving toward the door, I walked them out, standing on the porch as they stepped back into the same pattern of movement that had brought them here, and Emily paused for a moment before getting into the car, turning back to look at me, her expression uncertain but thoughtful, and I held her gaze without offering anything more than what was already there, because I understood that this process was not about giving her answers, it was about allowing her to see what had been there all along, and as they drove away, the car disappearing down the street, I stood there for a moment longer, the quiet returning in its familiar way, and I realized that this was no longer about a single event or a single decision, it was about a shift that had already taken hold, one that would continue to unfold whether it was acknowledged or not, and I turned back toward the house, stepping inside, closing the door behind me with a soft, steady motion, knowing that whatever came next would not be shaped by what I was given, but by what I chose to allow. The house felt different after they left, not emptier, not quieter, but more defined, as if the walls themselves had settled into a clearer understanding of what they held and what they no longer needed to carry, and I moved through the rooms slowly, not out of habit this time, but with intention, noticing the small details I had overlooked for years, the placement of objects, the arrangement of furniture, the way everything still reflected choices I had made long before anyone else had a say in this space. And I paused in the living room, my hand resting lightly on the back of the chair where Emily had been sitting, and I could still sense the hesitation in her voice, the careful way she had chosen her words, and it was not something I dismissed, because it meant she was beginning to see, not everything, not yet, but enough to recognize that the ground beneath her had shifted, and I did not feel satisfaction in that, only confirmation, because this was never about proving a point, it was about restoring something that had been quietly taken without acknowledgement, and as I turned toward the kitchen, I noticed my phone lighting up on the counter, a message from a number I recognized immediately, not Emily this time, but her husband, Daniel Carter, and that alone was enough to tell me that whatever was happening was no longer contained within a single perspective, and I wiped my hands on a towel before picking up the phone, opening the message with the same calm I had carried through every step so far, and his words were direct, polite, but carrying an undercurrent that did not need to be stated openly. He mentioned that there seemed to be some confusion regarding shared accounts, that they had noticed changes, that they wanted to make sure everything was aligned, and I read it once, then again, not searching for meaning, but observing the structure, the way it was framed, the choice of words that suggested concern without admitting responsibility, and I set the phone down without responding immediately, because timing, I had learned, was just as important as action, and instead, I walked to the cabinet, taking out a glass, filling it with water, allowing myself a moment to stand still, to feel the quiet of the house settle around me, and when I returned to the counter, I picked up the phone again, my response forming not from emotion, but from clarity, and I typed slowly, deliberately, choosing words that left no room for misinterpretation while also giving nothing unnecessary away. I told him that there was no confusion, that everything had been reviewed carefully, that all adjustments were made in accordance with existing structures, and that there was nothing further to discuss at this time. And when I pressed send, I did not wait for a reply. I placed the phone back down, turning my attention to the window where the late afternoon light was beginning to soften, because I understood that this was the moment where the shift would become more visible, not to me, but to them, and visibility often brings reaction, not always controlled, not always measured, but I was not concerned with that, because I had already positioned myself in a way that did not require me to respond to their reactions, only to my own decisions. And later that evening, the phone rang again, this time Emily, and I answered on the second ring, my voice steady, unchanged, and she did not begin with pleasantries this time. Her tone more direct, more urgent. Mom, Daniel said you made changes to the accounts, and I could hear the difference immediately, not just in what she said, but in how she said it, the absence of softness, replaced by something closer to pressure, and I let a small pause settle between us before responding, not to create tension, but to maintain the rhythm I had chosen. I have already reviewed everything, I said, and I kept my tone even, not defensive, not explanatory, just factual, and she exhaled sharply, not quite frustration, but close enough to recognize. But those were shared funds, she said, and there it was, the assumption laid out clearly, the belief that access equaled ownership, that familiarity equaled entitlement, and I listened without interrupting, because understanding someone's perspective does not mean agreeing with it, and when she finished, I spoke. Again, my voice calm, unwavering. They were never shared in the way you think, I said, and I did not elaborate, because the truth does not need to be stretched to be understood, it only needs to be stated, and there was a silence after that, heavier than before, filled with the sound of something shifting on the other end, something she had not prepared for, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter, more controlled. I think we need to talk about this in person, and I considered that for a moment, not because I was unsure, but because I understood what that conversation would represent, not a discussion, but an attempt to regain footing, to re-establish a structure that had already changed, and I answered simply, we already are, and I let the words settle, because sometimes the most direct response is the one that carries the most weight, and she did not argue immediately, she did not raise her voice, she simply stayed silent, and in that silence, I could feel it, the realization beginning to take hold, not fully, not yet, but enough to create a pause that would not easily disappear, and when she finally spoke, her voice was softer again, but different now, less certain. I did not know it would be like this, she said, and I heard the meaning beneath it, not an apology, not quite, but an acknowledgement that something had gone further than she expected, and I responded with the same steady clarity that had guided me from the beginning. Neither did I said, and that was all, because there are moments when adding more only weakens what has already been said. And we ended the call shortly after, not abruptly, but without resolution, and as I set the phone down, I looked around the kitchen once more, the same space, the same light, the same stillness, but everything within it now aligned with a truth that no longer needed to be questioned, and I understood that what was happening was no longer subtle, no longer hidden beneath polite conversations and unspoken assumptions. It was visible, undeniable, and still unfolding, and I moved toward the window, resting my hand lightly against the frame, looking out at the quiet street as the first shadows of evening began to stretch across the pavement, and I realized that whatever came next would not be shaped by their reactions, their questions, or their expectations. It would be shaped by the structure I had already put in place, one decision at a time, steady, deliberate, and entirely my own. 2 days later, Emily asked if we could meet again, but this time it was not framed as a casual lunch or a quiet visit. It was direct, intentional, and when she suggested that Daniel would join us, I understood immediately that this was no longer about uncertainty, it was about answers, or at least their version of them, and I agreed without hesitation, not because I was eager, but because I was ready, and we chose a small conference room at Daniel Harris's office, neutral ground, a space designed for clarity rather than comfort, and when I arrived, I was early as I always was, sitting at the table with my hands resting lightly in front of me, the folder Daniel had prepared placed neatly beside me, unopened, because I did not need to review it again. I already knew what it contained, and when the door opened, Emily walked in first, her expression composed but tight around the edges, followed by her husband, Daniel Carter, whose presence carried a different kind of energy, more controlled, more analytical, and they both greeted me politely, taking their seats across from me, and for a moment, no one spoke, the air settling into a quiet tension that did not feel uncomfortable, just precise, like the beginning of something that had been building for longer than anyone had acknowledged. And it was Daniel Carter who spoke first, his tone measured, professional. "Margaret, we just want to understand what changes were made and why." And I listened to the question without interruption, noting the choice of words, the way it was framed as a request for understanding rather than a challenge, and I nodded once, acknowledging the question before responding. "Everything that was done was already outlined years ago," I said, my voice calm, steady, and I let that statement stand for a moment, because it carried more weight than a longer explanation ever could, and I reached for the folder, opening it slowly, not dramatically, just deliberately, and I turned it toward them, sliding it across the table so they could see the documents clearly, and as they leaned forward, scanning the pages, I watched their expressions shift. Not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention, but in small, controlled ways, the tightening of a jaw, the narrowing of eyes, the slight pause before turning to the next page, and I spoke again, not to interrupt, but to guide. These structures were put in place with legal oversight, and they have always defined how access works, and I did not raise my voice, did not emphasize any particular word, because the truth does not require volume to be understood. And Emily looked up at me then, her expression different now, less certain, more searching. "But we have been managing things together," she said, and there was something in her tone that suggested she believed that history alone should have changed the reality of the structure, and I met her gaze steadily. "You have been participating, not owning," I replied, and I kept my tone even, not correcting her harshly, just clarifying, and the distinction settled between us, simple, undeniable. And Daniel Carter spoke again, his voice still controlled, but carrying a sharper edge now. "We were under the impression that these funds were shared for household use," and I nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it. "They were used that way because I allowed it," I said, and I paused just long enough for the meaning to be clear. "That does not make them shared," and there was a silence after that, heavier than before, not because of conflict, but because something had been defined in a way that could not be reinterpreted. And Emily looked down at the papers again, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the document, and I could see it in her posture, the realization not fully formed, but no longer avoidable, and she spoke more quietly this time. "So what happens now?" And it was a different kind of question, not about the past, not about justification, but about what came next, and I considered it carefully, not because I needed time, but because I understood the importance of the answer. And when I spoke, my voice remained calm, steady. "Now, everything continues exactly as it is structured," I said, and I let the words settle, not adding anything unnecessary, because clarity does not require elaboration. And Daniel Harris, who had been present but silent until now, shifted slightly in his seat, his role clear but unobtrusive, and he added a brief explanation of the legal framework, reinforcing what had already been established without inserting himself into the emotional weight of the conversation. And as the discussion continued, it did not escalate. There were no raised voices, no accusations, just a series of questions and answers that gradually revealed the full shape of what had been misunderstood for years, and I remained consistent in my tone, my posture, my responses, not reacting, not defending, simply stating what was already true. And by the time the conversation reached its natural conclusion, there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to reinterpret, only a structure that had always been there, now fully visible. And we stood, the meeting ending not with resolution in the emotional sense, but with clarity in the practical one. And as Emily gathered her things, she hesitated for a moment, looking at me as if there was something she wanted to say but had not yet found the words for, and I held her gaze calmly, not offering reassurance, not withdrawing either, simply present in a way that did not require anything more. And when they left the room, the door closing softly behind them, I remained seated for a moment longer, my hands resting lightly on the table, the folder now closed in front of me, and I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a steady sense of alignment, because this had never been about winning, it had been about restoring something that should never have been questioned in the first place. And as I stood, gathering my things, I understood that whatever came next would not be driven by reaction, but by recognition, and that recognition, once established, does not fade, it reshapes everything that follows.